National Signing Day 2015 is in the books. Mark Rogers TV looking at the ACC landscape with John Cassillo of Noon's Magician on the SB Nation platform. John, thanks so much for joining us. We've got Louisville, of course, entrenched in the ACC after a couple recruiting cycles for Bobby Petrino. Let's start there in regards to just looking at the entire landscape of the ACC, because I see a different ACC than what I saw just a few years ago, in that you've got some different players in the mix, with Georgia Tech playing some good football last season, getting to an Orange Bowl, and of course we just the aforementioned Louisville. So just your thoughts in looking around the ACC and what stood out to you today.
Obviously, Florida State is going to be a power until Jimbo Fisher leaves. That's just how it's going to be. You saw Florida State was really heavily involved in some of the biggest names, and landed a ton of the biggest names. I mean, you just rack up 5 stars there. I know I looked, I think it was in the ACC, Florida State grabbed the top player at 6 different positions. In the entire conference, and I think that speaks volumes about just how good and how deep and how fast this team is. I mean, obviously last year things didn't end well in the Rose Bowl, but at the same time, like, this is not a group that is just going to sit back and allow that to be everyone's memory for too long. I think you're going to see this team reload. There's so much talent. They're too deep at every position with NFL caliber players, and I think the prevailing story, as boring as it may seem to those who follow the ACC on a daily basis, is just going to be Florida State and their continued dominance over the rest of the conference.
Well, Florida State's obviously compiled these top 5 classes for a number of years. You mentioned under Jimbo Fisher. They weren't too bad under Bobby Bowden, even late in his career. Clemson matched them today. Now, one class isn't going to get it done, and Clemson's got some ground to make up, but Clemson had a pretty substantial class this one year.
I think Clemson, and you've seen a growing trend with them over the last probably 5 years. I think since Dabo Swinney's really shown up, you've seen a consistent stress on speed at the wide receiver positions, and then what we've seen in recent years is a new stress on the offensive and defensive lines, and I think that's where you've seen Clemson really start to contend and become a national power. I mean, maybe not with the same clout on an annual basis as the real blue bloods, but at the same time, I mean, this year's class, like, 2 of the best kids were Mitch Hyatt and Christian Wilkins, both of whom play on the line, offensive and defensively, respectively. I mean, their bread and butter is still going to be wide receiver, and that's where Deion Kane comes in, the kid they brought in from Tampa. But Clemson is definitely, I think, a program on the rise. I think last year might have fooled some people because there were some injuries. It was mostly a defensively led team that really just didn't have the same explosiveness anymore on offense. But this Clemson team is definitely a force to be reckoned with, and it's going to be interesting to see how Clemson and Florida State kind of duke it out in the Atlantic Division for the years to come.
Yeah, totally agree with you on the Clemson point, because it wasn't a sexy team last year. It wasn't the Taj Boyd, Sammy Watkins, Martavis Bryant, let's score 45 points a game and hopefully we hang on 45-38. And then when we run into a legitimate in the trenches team, we're going to get pushed around and knocked around, so we can't really compete with the Florida States or maybe a bowl situation. Versus these games don't look real pretty. We beat NC State 23-17. We beat BC, by 6 points. But wow, they were really good defensively last season, and I think the core is much stronger today than it was 3 years ago, even though it didn't look flashy on the stat sheet in regards to the offensive output. Anything else jump out in the ACC? Of course, Duke's behind a hard place in terms of trying to get the right kids there, but it seems as though David Cutcliffe's doing a nice job there, and he did grab one top 300 guy. Georgia Tech maybe doesn't necessarily get the recruiting ranking respect that you would think coming off the season that they had, but they seem to be pretty comfortable with the type players that they need there.
Well, I think Georgia Tech, to be honest, was not a surprise to me, but definitely a case study in what one really good bounce back season can do for you. Georgia Tech last year, I think they only had about 14 players in the recruiting class. They failed to get anybody from the state of Georgia. It was just a real failure on their part, and that's why people were seeing is this the end of the Paul Johnson era? Are we actually seeing that the triple option really doesn't work in a power conference? And then Georgia Tech goes out, wins 11 games, and ends up with 27 recruits in this class. I mean, again, none of these guys are going to fit into most programs, but from what Georgia Tech needed, I mean, they didn't get that elite guy, but they got 27 three-star guys, and for what they needed, and they really needed to reload at a lot of different positions. I think it works for them. I think that it's their typical. And a guy like Christian Philippot, I think we're going to see somebody who might. I mean, I'm not going to predict the next Calvin Johnson by any means, but I think we're looking at someone in that similar mold. Just a big physical receiver that's going to be a very, very, very good downfield blocker. So I think Georgia Tech, to me, is the other interesting story to watch, as they kind of got themselves back on track recruiting-wise.
The other storyline, John, that catches my attention is Miami, in that since they've cleared the sanctions, and even at the tail end of that situation, that they had brought in top 15 or 20 recruiting classes, and they've had strung several of those along. Now, signing day didn't land quite as well as they needed it to, but they still have a roughly top 20 class coming in, but it hasn't produced on the field, but they still have so much talent in their backyard that they almost can just kind of stumble into a top 20 class.
I think you hit the nail on the head there. I think that's kind of the issue with Miami, is that they can stumble into a top 20 class. So when they have only a top 20 class, I think that's where the issue lies. Admittedly, I haven't been overly impressed with Al Golden at Miami. I understand that he's dealt with some issues, in terms of sanctions and in terms of those 2 bowl bans. It wasn't an easy job by any means, but at this point, we're 2 years clear of those. There really isn't anything holding him back from turning Miami back into what it was those years ago, and yet Miami spins its wheels, gets a top 20 class, and then a bunch of those kids don't work out. Now, I really do like Brad Kaya and Duke Johnson. I think that team's going to rise and fall on what they can do this fall. But for everybody else, I mean, you can have as many 4-star talents as you want. At the end of the day, if they're not producing, and for the last few years they're not, I think you started asking questions about the staff.
Hey, John, before I let you go, I got to throw this one out at you because of your knowledge of the entire conference and how it stacks up, and you watch so much of all these teams, and especially the top tier teams. I'm in the midst of doing a bit of a series where I'm doing some comparative analysis. I've closed it off to a kind of closed test sample of just the Power 5 games played against each other. So those conference games played against one another. The ACC had a nice closing run in the regular season, winning 4 straight against the SEC. Had a decent run. So I'm still calculating the numbers, formulating a system to try to take the seedings into consideration and comparing these matchups. How good do you think the ACC performed in 2014, taking, again, the regular season matchups into consideration and then also the postseason play?
I think the ACC last year in particular was very heavy at the top. I think it's a trend that we're just going to see continue. I think you have Florida State, you have Clemson, you have Georgia Tech right now, and then I think you just kind of have a very muddled middle after those 3. So I think in terms of where it stacks up with the rest of the Power 5, I think you're seeing probably 4th, depending on how you want to evaluate the Big Ten. Obviously, Ohio State won the national championship. That's a nice boost. But largely, the Big Ten outside of that kind of existed very much like the ACC did the year before. A big national championship win, and beyond that, some nice bowl wins, but overall not really a top-to-bottom strength. I think that there's a lot of room to grow, but I think 4th for right now is probably where they're at. But you're seeing already, in this recruiting cycle, the lowest school, depending on who you ask, was around 60th in the national rankings. I mean, not amazing, but at the same time, look at where it was a few years ago, where you had Dukes and Wake Forest hanging around 80th. I think it's a big, big move up, and I think you're going to see the talent level in the conference rise over time.
probably a discussion for another time, but I would actually throw the Big 12 into that mix. The Big 12 did not perform well against the other Power 5 conferences and had those two elite teams and then a pretty significant drop-off. And, of course, we saw the Oklahoma-Clemson game, and that's just one game, but I think it was pretty much telling of the Big 12's performance overall. All right, John Cassillo of Noon's Magician joining us here on Mark Rogers TV. Hey, John, we appreciate the breakdown on the ACC.
Hey, thank you, Mark.